The Election Forums Committee welcomes you to the first of the forums to be presented before the general election that will be held on Tuesday, the 5th of November. Tonight, we will hear about two proposals that will appear on the November ballot. The moderator for tonight's forum is Bobby Spate.
Next year, I'm going to swap jobs with Bill. Welcome, everybody. Today, we have no candidates, which is quite unusual for many of us. But we have two complex issues before us at the general election. And the first part of our forum tonight will be presenting positions for and against and around Move Seattle. That's the City of Seattle's Proposition 1. While it's a continuation of an existing levy, it's expiring, and this will be a much larger dimension. It'll be funded by a tax on real estate property, and tonight we're welcoming an old colleague of mine, Charles Pressrud. He was a veteran transportation professional who will explain this proposal and will take questions. Now, Charles is a Seattle native, graduate of the University of Washington. He began his transportation career in Snohomish County with community transit, where he worked for 9 years, brave man. He then moved on to several years of consulting work before joining the Washington State Department of Transportation, WashDOT. He served in several capacities there as a planning manager for King and Snohomish counties. Wow. And he also was on the research board committee and research advisory panels and contributed to many transportation publications. He's now retired from WashDOT at the end of 2021. In 2022, he went to work for the Washington Policy Center. And for those of you who don't know about it, it's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that favors free market solutions. And I remind everybody now, Charles is going to take questions. But this is a forum, not a debate, so your questions should be succinct. They should be questions, not speeches. Okay, Charles, it's your turn.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for this invitation to come speak with this group. As you can imagine, for a transportation junkie like me, this is... Okay.
Or you can use a hand mic up there.
I'll try talking into this. For a transportation careerist like me, this is a fascinating issue. When I was first invited to come here, it was going to be a pro and con debate, and I was a little torn because this is a large, complex levy proposal, and there's something in it for almost everyone to like. There's also something in it for almost everyone to object to. So I wasn't sure exactly where to come down on that. What I'll do instead is give you an overview, and then I'll discuss some of the issues that are raised by the proposal, and you can form your own opinion at the end. As Bobby mentioned, this levy proposal is a little over $1.5 billion. That's over 8 years. It's a property tax increase, approximately $500 per median priced house per year. As you know, housing prices in the Seattle area and Puget Sound region have been going up rapidly. It used to be that $1 million house was a rare thing, but no more. And by the way, the median is now about $800,000. This replaces and it increases the levy from 2015 that is expiring. It increases it about 70% over the previous levy, which was $870 million or $900 million, something like that, over 9 years. And it funds a very wide variety of transportation projects and transportation-related programs. It is the largest property tax increase in Seattle history. Some of you may already have seen this graph, which was included in the packet that was left at your chairs. Fortunate coincidence. I stole this from the SDOT's website. And as you can see, about $400 million for street maintenance and modernization, $221 million for bridges and structures, $193 million for pedestrian safety, $160 million for Vision Zero. That's the program to improve safety and reduce automobile and pedestrian fatalities and accidents. Also some for neighborhood safety. $151 million for transit corridors and connections. That's mostly to improve city infrastructure around the light rail stations and bus rapid transit or rapid ride routes. $133 million for bicycle safety, $100 million for signals and operations, $69 million for climate resiliency, $66.5 million for people, streets, and public spaces, $45 million for freight and goods movement. A lot of that's associated with the port. And then about $7 million for what they call good governance. And a big part of that is just monitoring and reporting on how the funds are spent. So you might ask, well, do we really need a levy of this size that spends on the things that have been identified? And this is a chart that was taken from another SDOT publication where they monitor the condition of the city's transportation infrastructure. And what it shows is between 2003 and 2017, the condition of Seattle's streets actually got a little bit worse. The two bottom categories, the reddish one at the bottom, that's streets that are in very poor or failing condition, and the orange bar is just poor condition. So that gives you a pretty good indication that despite the previous levy, the condition of the city's streets has been deteriorating. And in case you were wondering, ordinarily, civil engineers suggest repaving streets about every 15 years. It can be a little bit more often if it's a street with a lot of traffic, truck traffic and things like that. It can be less often if it's a low-volume residential street. It can also depend on other things, you know, whether you have seismic instability or drainage problems. This graph shows how that problem has come about. This graph runs from 2007 through 2024, and what it shows is the city has not been spending enough on its streets. As you would expect from engineers, they use some jargon here. The asset sustainability ratio target of 1 means that if you're spending below that, you're not spending enough to keep up with the ongoing deterioration of the infrastructure. And it has never been at the target ratio of 1 for the last 18 years. In recent years, it's been falling well below that. And that means that there's a lot more deterioration and deferred maintenance. You may have heard earlier this year, SDOT issued a press release boasting that they had filled 25,000 potholes in the year 2023. Well, I'm glad they filled those potholes, but that's really not something you should be bragging about, because the reason there are 25,000 potholes is because they haven't been repaving the streets enough, and so they've been falling apart. And once a street condition, pavement condition deteriorates to a certain extent, it's not a cheap fix anymore. You have to scrape off all the old asphalt. You have to fix what is broken underneath, the drainage and everything else. And it costs about 5 times as much to do a complete reconstruction. So that's the argument in favor of keeping up with ongoing maintenance needs. Seattle also has a lot of bridges, as I'm sure you know. In fact, SDOT has responsibility for 122 bridges around the city. And many of them were built in the 1920s or 30s, some of them even older than that. And that's everything from small pedestrian bridges to major structures like the Ballard Bridge and the Magnolia Bridge, which used to be called the Garfield Street Bridge. That's what my dad always called it. And many of those were built before modern standards, before they had seismic and earthquake standards, and so they represent a significant liability because they're going to need to be replaced or upgraded at some point. What this graph shows is that in recent years, the city has been spending less than $50 million a year on bridge replacement and maintenance. It also shows, once you look at the graph, out beyond year 2026, needs increase substantially, which means that there are a lot of older bridges that are going to need major work. And by the city's estimate, it'll be about $150 million a year or more. It wouldn't surprise me if it turns out to be a lot more than that, because this graph is from a couple years ago, and as we know, prices for major civil engineering work have been going up rather dramatically. So there's a strong case to be made that a transportation levy is needed. And the reasons are pretty clear. The city has a lot of old infrastructure, bridges, streets, retaining walls, things like that. There's been many years of underinvestment, despite the previous transportation levies. Costs are increasing due to inflation, new environmental regulations, and the bid climate. And the bid climate, of course, doesn't refer to weather. It's because there are so many big projects being built, both by public agencies and by private entities in the Puget Sound region. There's a limited number of contractors that are capable of handling those kind of big, complex projects, and a limited number of civil engineers and planners and such. And the result is the firms that do that kind of work are getting kind of picky, and they're bidding kind of high. And this is one of the things that bit Sound Transit. You may remember just last week, they announced that the cost for the West Seattle Light Rail extension had gone up by a couple $2 billion. So it isn't just Sound Transit that's facing that problem. And as I say, I think it is very likely that SDOT will discover, especially on some of their big bridge projects and major pavement rehabilitation, that it's going to end up costing more than they have estimated. There's also increasing demands on the transportation system. The city of Seattle population continues to grow. It's got, 750,000 people living in Seattle now, something like that. There's much more truck traffic, more heavy vehicles, and more demand for bike lanes and things like that. The priorities of the city have shifted somewhat, and there's greater emphasis on pedestrian accessibility, and of course, the wish list in City Hall is ever expanding. So there's definitely plenty of reason to think that substantial transportation levy is needed. So now, the concerns. As I mentioned earlier, according to SDOT's own analysis, funding for street maintenance is inadequate. It has been inadequate for some time, and this levy, even though it directs about $400 million to street maintenance, that isn't nearly enough according to the city's own analysis, which means that pavement condition, the condition of the streets in the city, will actually be worse at the end of the 8 years than they are now. The situation with bridge funding is similar. There are going to be a number of very big ticket items, and as the city's own graph showed, the funding is nowhere near what they say they need. In fact, this levy would only spend about $25 or $30 million a year on bridge maintenance and replacement, when the city's own estimate shows they need over $100 million a year, and in some of the out years, more like $150 million a year. Wouldn't surprise me if it turns out to be even more. There's also a question about the cost effectiveness of some of the projects. Spends $33 million on bike lanes. And, I wouldn't want to say that bike lanes aren't a good thing to have, but they really need to be evaluated pretty carefully because some of them are more useful, have more safety benefits, will be used by more cyclists than others. If you've driven around the city, you may have noticed that there are some bike lanes that have very little utilization. And if it's a situation where a bike lane is replacing a vehicular travel lane, then you're gaining bike mobility, but you may be losing roadway capacity that you want. Another question has been raised about the levy's spending on climate issues. And of course, we're all concerned about that, and we want to reduce CO2 emissions. But I haven't been able to get anything out of the city that tells me exactly how much CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions are going to be reduced. It's kind of like a statement of good intentions that they want to spend many millions of dollars on, but it's not obvious that it is actually going to change the outcome at all. And then some projects should be funded from other sources. That's just my judgment, but for instance, the levy will spend money on transit security and improvements around transit stations. That's about $15 million. But we did approve Sound Transit and gave them a very generous source of revenue. They take in more than $2 billion a year. And we have King County Metro that has a budget over about $1 billion a year. And if there's a need for transit security, a case could be made that those agencies should be the ones that fund it. Similarly, the levy would fund improved pedestrian safety around schools, which is another one of those things that no one can possibly object to, and I certainly don't. But I'm not sure this levy has taken a hard look at whether all of those projects are really needed, and I'd also wonder whether that's the best source of revenue to pay for them. The state has a Safe Routes to School program that has provided more than $100 million in grants to cities around the state for exactly those kind of improvements. And it seems to me that they should have some mercy on city taxpayers and pursue those grants instead of increasing property taxes. The levy proposal will also spend $7.5 million on governance. Well, governance is certainly a good thing, but it's not clear to me why that should be funded with transportation dollars. Another concern that has been raised is that the property tax increase will make housing less affordable and raise the cost of living in Seattle. And I still live in Seattle, and I get my property tax bill twice a year, so this is something that I'm sensitive to. And it isn't just a cost that is imposed on property owners, it increases the cost of living for everybody because those costs are passed along by businesses and landlords pass them along to their renters. So this is something that will make housing less affordable. And finally, it isn't clear exactly what projects will be funded. That graph that we saw at the start, the pie chart, provides dollar amounts for the various categories, but when you read the fine print, it's not at all clear how all of that money will be spent. So if you have great confidence in the decision makers in City Hall, you don't need to worry. But if you're someone like me, you want to see the details because $1.5 billion can be used for a lot of good things, and it could also be peanut buttered around for a lot of vanity projects that don't actually make the transportation system work any better. So for my closing observations, I'd say there is clearly a need for increased investment in Seattle's transportation infrastructure. And the levy, to its credit, does begin to address some of those needs. However, it continues to significantly underfund maintenance and preservation, and this will result in much higher costs in the future. It may also result in some less than desirable safety impact, because, if you've driven around the city and you see all the potholes and the failing expansion joints and the missing guardrail and things like that, those do represent a hazard, and not just for people who drive, but for cyclists in particular. Those big potholes are just a terrible hazard. For many taxpayers, it is unclear whether the levy will produce benefits equal to the burden imposed. Now, if you're a devoted cyclist and you live in a low-rent apartment in Fremont or Ballard, this levy proposal probably looks great. It does a lot of good things for you. But let's say you live in a part of the city where you drive and the streets are in poor condition and you wouldn't benefit from the bike lanes or the transit improvements. You may be thinking, $500 a year is a lot to pay for this if it's not doing anything for me. And if voters do not approve the levy, and I haven't seen the latest polling, rumors are both ways on this one, so I don't know how it's going to turn out. But the needs are so great that there's about a 100% possibility that the city will devise a revised levy proposal and it will go on the ballot again in 2025. What that looks like will probably depend on the outcome of the vote and which groups complain the loudest. So that's my quick overview and my concerns. If you have any questions, I'm certainly trying to answer them.
You get to,
Okay.
hold on here. You get to get that microphone,
Okay.
and our team of walkers and talkers will hopefully see, and I'll be spotting people who want to talk.
I know the funding was of a different source, but I just rode the G line for the first time, and it seems really absurd to have spent all that money to make a bus line that makes fewer stops, takes up half the street, and isn't as good as our old number 12. But I know it was federal money, but who made the decision to do that?
The G line is the rapid ride route that goes out Madison, and that was many years in the making. That route was one with pretty good ridership, and what surprised me about that is that they got Sound Transit to help pay for some of it, and I don't know how that came about. But the intent of Metro's Rapid Ride program is to make the service more attractive, and in some ways it does, and in other ways, if it has fewer stops, it's less convenient. They aren't terribly concerned, or at least they haven't been, about traffic impacts for people who drive. And so the rapid ride improvements very often include dedicated bus lanes, signal priority systems for buses, and things like that make transit a little bit faster and a little bit more reliable. But as to how the funding came about, it was about a $200 million program to improve bus service on that route. I don't know how that sausage got made.
Speaking just as a non-driver anymore, but with friends in the Madison Valley or family in the Madison Valley, people who are taking Madison now, I think the same as what Susan is talking about. Madison is a nightmare. I used to drive there many years ago. It was such an easy ride from the lake to downtown or to wherever I was going. Now it's stop and go. This road is closed. The bus is driving in the middle. You can't make a left turn. You can't make a. Whoever designed it should go back to the university or some university. I mean, that in itself is going to kill this levy. Because if more streets are going to be designed like that street, it's a disaster.
Shall I?
There is an awful lot of traffic coming into Seattle, which creates all kinds of problems, and usage on the roads in town. Is there a way to have them help pay this fee like they're doing in New York City?
Well, I'm sure the folks in City Hall would love to tax anyone from outside who comes into the city. They haven't found a way to do that yet. The best they have been able to come up with is increasing the cost of parking on the street at meters and at some of the city-owned parking facilities. But if you mean some kind of like a cordon charge or a congestion charge, such as New York was considering, I don't see that happening anytime soon, even though there are people in City Hall who would love to do it. Part of the reason is the legislature is looking at their own possible tolling schemes, and they don't want any cities messing things up yet until the state decides what they're going to do. So.
You described the inadequacy of the current bill or thing that we're voting on to really bring and keep the infrastructure, up to where it needs to be. What do you think is the solution to bringing it up to where it needs to be?
Clearly, more needs to be spent on basic preservation and maintenance. And when the City Council was putting this levy proposal together, and initially the mayor provided the first proposal, and then it went to the City Council, they got a lot of input, and they didn't seem able to really establish any priorities. So what we get is an awful lot of the levy. More than 2/3 of it is not used on street maintenance and preservation. It's for other things. And I think the policymakers in City Hall need to sit down and really establish street maintenance and preservation and bridge maintenance and preservation as the top priorities, adequately fund them. And I would go for more than 8 years, because it's going to take them longer than that to bring the system up to a state of good repair. I'd go for probably at least a 12-year levy if they can, and focus on that. And that's about it.
I'm a survivor of the sidewalk on Broadway. Having emerged with a fractured knee and a fractured elbow. And so I also read a critique of the proposed levy that called it car-centric. And I can't really identify how pedestrian life will be improved from this circle. Could you explain that a little more succinctly?
I'll try. The levy proposes to spend $193 million on pedestrian safety, and then some additional tens of millions on people, streets, and public spaces, and $160 million on Vision Zero school and neighborhood safety, and much of that is sidewalks and pedestrian improvements. So if anything, it spends much more heavily on bike and pedestrian improvements, certainly much more than any previous levy in the city, in city history. But you make a good point that a lot of sidewalks in the city are in terrible condition. The city has not spent enough on them for a long time. It hasn't really cracked the whip on developers who build new buildings of all kinds, but too often they get away without having to make the sidewalk improvements in front of their property that are needed. So, and then there's one other problem too, and that is in Seattle we love trees. I do too. And we have a lot of street trees, which are wonderful and make the streetscape a more pleasant place. But as you've seen, the roots of those trees, when they get big, they bust up the sidewalks. And so, and that's a problem that's not going away. It will probably get worse over the next dozen years as street trees continue to grow and crack the sidewalks. So I think the levy spends a lot on that. Whether it's the right amount, I can't say. But clearly, there is a lot of work that needs to be done there.
Is a moderator allowed to ask a question?
Nah, your questions are too tough. I don't Okay.
If it's approved, is there flexibility in that pie chart?
My understanding is there is some leeway, and I think the city council would have to vote on it. But what we're approving with the levy is a tax rate, and the pie chart is for kind of illustrative purposes. So,
Charles?
Hello, I'm over here. I'd be very interested to know whether the planners have studied the systems in other countries in Europe where they may or may not have as many hills, but have far more complex problems. I have a sense that there is not enough international study of traffic in their knowledge.
well, I probably shouldn't speak for the people at the city of Seattle who devised this levy. I know some of them have been to Amsterdam and Copenhagen. They love to go on junkets to those places, by the way. But it's a little bit easier politically in those places than it is in almost any city in the United States. So I can assure you, usually the city councils or the governmental entities that are responsible for transportation in European countries have more clout. And in the United States, it's less so the case.
So what does it take to become practical?
I think it boils down to who we elect to the city council and to the mayor's office, as well as some laws that are built into our system.
So I'm listening to you, and I'm torn between wanting to vote for this because we need the maintenance and the modernization now, or thinking we could get a better package if we voted against it. So do you have your own sense of whether we need to move forward and pass this, or if we could get something better if we vote against it?
You've perfectly summarized the conclusion from my presentation. I'm torn the same way. I wish I could say, if we vote it down, we'll get a much better package. I'm not confident that that'll happen. You'll all have to just make up your own minds on that, and I'm struggling with it myself.
Since, or if the levy as a real property tax is inadequate to fund what is necessary, what other sources of revenue might the city council approach and levy taxes or raise revenue on?
That's a good question. If I was running for office, I would dodge it by saying, well, that's really outside my area of expertise. There are a number of revenue sources that the city has at their disposal. The property tax is only one. They also collect a sliver of the retail sales tax. They actually get a lot of revenue from that because it applies to construction too. And when construction around here is booming, as much as a fifth of the city's tax revenue comes from construction. So, they love Martin Sillig because he was building all these buildings. They also collect revenue from parking meters and other city activities. There's a rental car tax and things like that. So they could fund some of the transportation needs using revenue they collect from other sources. Because the city likes to spend money on other things besides transportation, they prefer not to do that. There are also, of course, federal grants and state grants, which the city of Seattle has pursued in the past and sometimes received. So they have some options. They also have the ability to issue bonds and use the proceeds to build things. Of course, they have to pay the bonds off with interest, but that is a way that they can advance construction and get things built sooner. I'm sorry I can't give you a more specific answer than that.
I think we get one more question. I already asked a question, so. Microphone.
This is just a information question. Some of these categories are so vague, like climate resiliency. If we look online, will we find detail about what they mean by that?
I hope you have better luck finding that detail than I did. Actually, I have a sheet here that has just a few. I don't think it provides any details in the little two-pager. So I have wondered myself, and I wish the city provided more detail on how they were going to do that.
Charles, we really thank you for spending this time tonight to open our minds and our hope for a better outcome, and we've learned a lot tonight. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
Don't forget your, okay. Our next educational program tonight deals with the complicated and contentious issue of how to improve climate health. And we are blessed, I think, that the Seattle Channel produced, I think, a very balanced forum on this subject that will tell us the pros and the cons of this state ballot issue. So I turn this over to Risa.
Hello, I'm your host, Brian Calania. As the world celebrates Earth Day this April, a key environmental policy in Washington faces a major test from a statewide initiative.
The CCA will benefit everyone in Washington state.
The 2021 CCA, or Climate Commitment Act, requires top polluters to pay for their emissions by buying allowances at quarterly auctions.
This is a fight for our future. This is a fight for our kids' future.
Over time, as the cap on pollution comes down.
Since it went into effect last year, the Cap and Invest program has brought in more than $1.8 billion, which goes towards programs aimed at fighting the effects of climate change.
Companies that build clean technologies are eager to locate here, and companies that are already here are investing in decarbonizing their operations.
But opponents of the CCA say it's hurting, not helping our state.
The Climate Commitment Act is responsible for Washington's gas prices being 50 cents to $1 more expensive than gas prices in every other state.
Mega donor Brian Haywood is funding the group Let's Go Washington, which collected more than 400,000 signatures to get a CCA repeal measure on the ballot this November.
This hidden gas tax, we knew it was there, we knew people were upset, but the upset was building.
The governor says a repeal would only benefit fuel suppliers, already making record profits.
We're not going to succumb to the big oil companies that are trying to destroy our pollution laws in the state of Washington.
And if the CCA goes away, the state says we'll lose a key tool for carbon compliance.
What doesn't go away is the mandate that our emissions get down to net zero by 2050. We know as a state, as a country, as a world, that we need to take action to reduce climate impacts.
The debate over global warming heats up.
The people really have demanded we do something about this.
That if we pass the initiative, then we allow unlimited pollution in the state.
The poorest, brownest Washingtonians are the people that breathe the worst air.
That average people don't like having the money taken away from them.
Analyzing Initiative 2117, next on City Inside Out. And to learn more about this issue, we have a panel with us that includes State Representative Jim Walsh, the Republican from the 19th District in Aberdeen, the author of 2117. Good to have you here.
Great to be here.
We also have with us House Majority Leader Joe Fitzgibbon. He is the Democratic representative of the 34th District in West Seattle area. Joe, good to have you as well. Thanks, Brian. And also we have with us Paula Sardinas, CEO of the Washington Build Back Black Alliance. Paula, good to see you.
Good to be here.
And also we have with us Glenn Morgan, founder of the media outlet We the Governed. Glenn, good to have you as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's jump into this. And Representative Walsh, if you could, give us a brief opening statement and make the case, if you would, for Initiative 2117. Why did you write this measure? What would it do if it were passed?
Right. I-2117 repeals the cap-and-trade tax scheme that we call the Climate Commitment Act here in Washington. The problem with this system, with this program, is that it promises to reduce carbon outputs, carbon pollution, and doesn't do that. What it does do is it raises a bunch of tax revenue for the state of Washington in the billions that's paid for primarily by middle-class working families who need to put fuel in their vehicles, who need to heat their homes, and are paying an indirect tax in the cost of gasoline, the cost of diesel fuel, the cost of any kind of carbon-based fuel to do the daily things of life.
Okay.
And it's affecting the cost of groceries because you have to truck groceries into grocery stores. It's affecting utility bills of all sorts, whether you're natural gas or not. And the people really have demanded we do something about this.
Okay.
It was the most popular of a group of initiatives that we qualified recently.
Yeah, we'll talk about those signatures in just a little bit, but Representative Fitzgibbon, why are you saying no to 2117?
Sure. So Initiative 2117 would allow unlimited pollution in Washington state. It eliminates the cap on Washington's pollution that is starting to work to protect Washingtonians' health. It allows the pollution that harms our lungs, that harms our climate, that harms our landscapes, that harms salmon. And at the same time as eliminating all of those caps on pollution and allowing unlimited pollution, it does away with funding for things like food security for the hungriest people in our state, for wildfire suppression and prevention, for salmon recovery, for investments in traffic safety, and for the equipment that we need to actually monitor our air quality and ensure that we're making progress towards improving the health of people in our state. So at the same time as we allow unlimited pollution, we do away with a lot of things that are really important to the people of our state in protecting their health.
Thank you for that. Paula, let me ask you why the black business community is at the table on this issue.
Well, we're at the heart of the pollution matter. The poorest, brownest Washingtonians are the people that breathe the worst air. And we know we've been talking about this for nearly 50 years, right? Those dollars mandate that 35% of these investments go to those overburdened communities. And so we're talking about respiratory illnesses like asthma. We know that life expectancy with COVID has decreased 3 years in the black and brown community. We're talking free transportation for children under the age of 18, repairing roads, investing in things like community gardens, decarbonizing housing, making that housing that we build today more affordable, but making sure that those housing opportunities that we're building, that they are environmentally friendly. And so for the first time in a generation, I'm 51, we are leaving our children a better planet than the one that we've got. So we're saying it is not a binary choice. Vote no to rolling back on these environmental protections.
Okay, thank you. Glenn, I know you've studied this issue with We the Government, and I wanted to get your take on this because we're hearing this week that companies like Amazon, a major carbon footprint from that company, BP runs the largest oil refiner in our state, some of our biggest polluters, I guess you'd say, are saying no to 2117. They support the Climate Commitment Act, and 3 years ago when the CCA went into effect, it was held up as an example of when advocates, big polluters, tribes, a lot of people came together to deal with climate change. I just wanted to talk about all the support that this No campaign has right now and all the support that went into brokering this deal initially with the CCA. Why do you think voters should tear that apart?
Well, I think it's not a hard one, actually, as somebody who volunteered actually collecting signatures out there in Seattle and other places around Washington. And people basically don't like the fact that their taxes are going up and that government's telling them that they can spend the money better than they can. And so they're essentially spending a lot more on gas and heating their home, and then giving that money to multi-billion-dollar corporations like you just named, and then presuming that the tax benefit that they get from their back pocket, you're basically taking money from the poorest people in the state, and you're giving it to billionaires and other companies so that they can spend that money better than supposedly you can. And I noticed that the people who are supporting the opposition campaign include people like Bill Gates and other billionaires. And so if they really think these are great programs, they should fund them directly. They clearly have the resources to do it. They shouldn't be trying to take the money from poor people and then basically make it easier for some of their investments to profit for themselves. And so I think it's really clearly something that average people don't like, having the money taken away from them and the government telling them they can spend it better.
Got it. And let's try to dive into some of these issues. Representative Fitzgibbon, I'll draw you in here. So when the CCA passed in 2021, Governor Inslee said it would result in pennies more at the gas pump for consumers. And I know you've heard this argument here because, as it turned out, drivers saw prices go above $5 a gallon in the summer of 2022 and 23. And still today, Washington State is more than $1 over the national average price per gallon. Supporters of 2117 would say the reason why is fuel suppliers are paying more for the Climate Commitment Act. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, unfortunately, all Washingtonians are experiencing high costs of housing, of food, of healthcare, of energy, and that's something that people are struggling with, and we just have to be upfront about that. Unfortunately, Washington and the entire West Coast have always had higher gas prices than the rest of the country, and 2022 is a great example. The highest gas prices we've ever seen in Washington were in the summer of 2022, before the Climate Commitment Act took effect. The Climate Commitment Act didn't take effect until January of 2023. That's right. But the historic high that we've ever seen in gas prices happened a few months after Russia invaded Ukraine. Now we see these geopolitical incidents that cause huge volatility in the price of gasoline, which is why it's so important that Washingtonians have better choices than being tied to those global oil markets, which we're providing through the Climate Commitment Act, through investments in things like free transit for people who are under 18, through expanded electric vehicle charging, through investments in biofuel infrastructure. So we don't have to be tied to what's going on in the Persian Gulf, what's going on in Russia, what's going on in Venezuela, as we historically have been.
Representative Walsh, maybe a reaction to that, and Paul, I'll draw you in.
Sure. People don't care about Ukraine or Venezuela. People care about their household budgets. People care about what gas costs at the pump.
But you don't think that's connected to gas prices?
Well, I mean, everything's connected to everything. Okay. The biggest cost driver in the last couple of years of the price at the pump here in Washington has been this cap-and-trade tax scheme. And it's leaking over into things like utility bills. People are beginning to see their utility bills go up. And we've seen a lot of dodgy behavior on the part of some elected officials in Libya, not Joe, and not me, but others who've been hiding the effects of this cap-and-trade scheme on utility bills. And that's bad stuff. And people have a good sense that it's bad stuff, and they want change.
Okay. Paula, you had something you wanted to say.
I wanted to put a bookend on that because what Representative Fitzgibbon said is absolutely true, and it's just a false narrative. There was $4 gas in Florida. They don't have cap and trade. It was in 2022. You know what happened there? Hurricanes. You know what causes hurricanes? Environmental justice. There was $4.60 gas in Texas in 2022. You know what happened there? Tornadoes. These were large Republican-run states. When you have geopolitical crisis, it drives up the cost of gas. In 2022, you also had $3 and $4 gas in California. After they passed CARB in 2013, gas prices actually went down in California for nearly a decade. These are not my facts. These are on the EPA's website. You can look it up. Whenever you have geopolitical crisis, gas prices are cyclic. So it was not just Washington State that experienced the gas spikes that happened across the country in both blue and red states. These are geopolitical issues. These are not cap and trade issues.
Glenn, maybe I can have you respond to this, because I got some numbers from the State Department of Ecology about this, too, because when this allowance auction program started in 2023, allowance prices and gas prices were both rising, right? But now, even as allowance prices have dropped this year by 50%, gas prices are still going up. They're 32% high, 32 cents, I should say, higher since the last auction ended on March 13th. So here we are in mid-April recording this program. We're about 27 cents higher than we saw in our state last year. So I'm trying to figure this out here with all that in mind. I mean, how much do you trust that gas prices will significantly drop, that oil companies, which are making record profits, are somehow going to change their ways if the CCA is repealed?
Well, there's no doubt that you're paying more for fuel as a direct result of other things as well as taxes. But taxes are the thing that you can actually control. And so eliminating the costs, the extra costs that you're burdening average people with, as just some kind of a kickback scheme to vendors and special interests who basically sign on to it. You have billions of dollars that the legislature likes to, or politicians like to be able to direct to their special interests, preferably those who are giving them campaign contributions, or billionaires like Bill Gates, who does make that he's clearly investing in this opposition to this initiative. It's not a hard thing to communicate to people that the government's not going to spend the money that you give them better than you will, and you need that money, especially right now with inflation. So I think finding ways to reduce the cost of living for average people and not divert that cash out of their pocket into the pocket of special interests is something that most people really do appreciate.
I did want to focus on the climate piece of it, though, because our state has goals to be carbon-free by the year 2050, and if not using the CCA as a tool, what tool would you use to get to that?
Well, number one, I would stop burning our forests, which is largely done through basically incompetent forest management, which Washington's had now for about 50 years. As a small farm forestry person myself, I can tell you that if you want to find incompetence in forest management, come to Washington, because we put on classes on how to demonstrate how to burn our forests up that's simply a direct result of bad government policy. It's not a hard one. That dumps more carbon in the air than almost anything else. And if you want to have bad quality air in Washington, see what happens when you burn your forests up.
Transportation, though, is a huge piece of it, and fossil fuels, right? I mean, I think that's a big piece of what the CCA is trying to go after here.
Well, they say that, but the problem is if you actually look at how the money gets diverted, it always gets diverted into companies that conveniently are making a lot of money off, and basically they're profiting on the backs of little people, basically taking their money, taking $1,000 a year extra in fuel costs. If it was so great, then Bob Ferguson wouldn't have threatened Puget Sound Energy with litigation if they actually revealed on the bill how much their energy costs were actually going up every bill that came out.
Okay. Did you have a response you wanted to throw to that, Representative Fitzgibbon? I just want to make sure I was given equal time here.
I don't think it's an accident that the Climate Commitment Act passed in 2021 when less than 6 months before that we saw 2 and 3 weeks of choking smoke throughout the entire state. Not just in areas on those front lines that have been most impacted by wildfires, but everybody in the whole state was choking on smoke. Yeah. At the same time as we were supposed to stay outside to avoid COVID, we were also trying to avoid going outside because of how smoky it was. We were seeing those impacts of climate change already, and I think that really catalyzed Washingtonians and legislators into saying we need to do more, we need to find funding to fight fires and to prevent fires, but also we need to get to the root cause of the heat that's causing our forests to be more vulnerable to those kinds of fire events.
And a lot of that smoke came from British Columbia. Yeah. And a lot of the carbon pollution, the fossil fuel pollution that we're concerned about comes from farther away than British Columbia. Okay. Comes from India, comes from China. It's kind of arrogant to think that Washington state, by passing a cap-and-trade tax scheme, is going to single-handedly change the carbon outputs that are a global phenomenon. What we ought to do is engage the real polluters, which Washington state is not, about better environmental policy in their backyards.
Well, they are engaging people like BP. I mean, we talk about the largest oil refinery in our state, BP, and they're the group that's saying no to 2117.
Well, because they're self-interested. They're getting money from the scheme.
And they're trying to create some green fuels, et cetera, right?
Well, what we need to do is, if we're going to tackle a global issue, we need to have a global reach. And penalizing working families in Longview, in Kent, and Auburn, and Whidbey Island is not the solution to a climate disaster that's caused by Bangalore and Shekwang province.
I really do see the state of Washington, though, reaching out to other places like California and Quebec, for example, to try to build what they're trying to do with this cap-and-trade system here. And I can see that reach, but if it doesn't start with our state, then we couldn't get to that larger reach in the first place. Do you see that grow?
But the linkage will work the wrong way. I mean, the market for these indulgences that are auctioned off by bureaucrats, permissions to pollute, is inefficient in its DNA. And that's the reason why the proponents of the scheme are trying to grow their way out of the losses. It's like we're losing efficiency in our system here, but if we grow bigger, we'll gain efficiency somehow. There's no indication that's true.
But Representative Walsh, I would say this. I think when we start talking in these esoteric platitudes, what we do is we confuse people, we confuse voters.
They're not confused, Paula. They want to overturn this cap.
They are, because what we don't do and what we have done with the WBBA is we've gone to people and we've sat down at their kitchen tables and we have explained this in a way that makes sense. What we've said to them is, think about it when he says, you know, we're doing linkage and it's a scheme. It's not a scheme. You know, middle-class person, how do you get your packages? You order them through Amazon, right? They come through these little vans. Well, that's an MHD. Part of what cap and trade has done is these medium to heavy-duty vehicles, we are replacing those with electric vehicles. The #1 emitters of GHG gases are these vehicles that are traveling up and down your roadways every single day. No. Do you know who lives among I-5 in these corridors? They are your poorest people and they're your middle-class people. Yeah. They live in Kent, they live in Seattle, they live in Tacoma, they live in the CID. And so if you want to reduce pollution, you have to take these MHDs off of the roads. You have to reduce the number of fossil fuel vehicles that are traveling. That's what companies like Amazon are doing. They're reducing those vehicles. They're reducing the size and they're electrifying their fleets. These dollars are being invested in the TES, the Transportation Electrification Strategy, to reduce those number of vehicles so that Washington, like California, by 2030 and 2050 can electrify the state. It is not a scheme. We're saying we believe your life is worth saving. That is going to overall reduce your cost. And that's what, when we start talking in these lofty terms so that people don't understand it, we think we're giving them a binary choice. And then we're taking those dollars and we're reinvesting those in those working class communities with those people.
And Paula, I just want to make sure I broadened it out, because the CCA has brought in $1.8 billion so far from these auctions. And I know the governor said to take away that money would be a torpedo to the state budget. And I wanted to talk about just some of the different programs. You talked about electrifying some different vehicles. We're talking about a program that pays for utility bills for some low-income people.
$320 million.
Free transit for kids. Farmers get help pay for fuel. Tribes like the Quinault Indian Nation can create ecosystem restoration projects. I just wanted to talk about some of the different people that are benefiting from these projects, so we lay that out there and we'll get some input on that.
There are grants that Commerce has just put out that are doing salmon recaptures right now. That grant is going out. We just did $85 million for charging infrastructure in the Tri-Cities, which is an area of Washington State that is a heavily Republican district where no one in that district supported CCA. You know, more than $20 million is going into charging infrastructure out there so that, again, you're going to have electric buses, but you're also going to have charging stations at their public transit. So areas where you normally don't have public transportation, that will be electrified. Okay. Meaning you're going to have electric cars, so that there are nonprofits and there are CBOs out there. You can go and you can get the little electric car. WashDOT put out a grant. It's called the ZAP grant. You get the car, now you have a way to charge it. Okay. So people in community, people that don't speak English, people that don't normally have transportation, you can get a car, now you have a way to charge it and get that infrastructure. If you repeal CC, all of that goes away. You have transportation deserts in community. Okay. That's what these dollars pay for in Benton Franklin County.
Got it. Glenn, maybe I can bring you in here, because there's clearly a push by the CCA to help out overburdened communities. I've heard that phrase used.
And underserved communities.
And underserved communities also feeling the effects of climate change the most here. Let me know about that. Advocates would say repealing the CCA would really strike a blow there, as Paul is bringing up. What do you think?
Well, I mean, extracting cash from people and then saying, here, I'm going to give you some of the money back that I took from you is not exactly an efficient way of explaining to somebody. If I come to your house, say, let me give me $1,000 and I'll give you $100 back. You know, that's how government tends to operate these tax schemes. You can solve the same goals if they make sense without having to tax people for it. You have multi-billion-dollar corporations and billionaires who frankly have the ability to fund all these operations by themselves, but instead have chosen to fund them on the backs of just average low-income people. I'm on the board of the State Farm Bureau as well, and I was just at our board meeting and we officially endorsed 2117 there, and there was no doubt at all in it, because the thousands of farmers in Washington State don't want to pay more in taxes that keep getting imposed on them, because that, like everything else, gets sent down the food chain and people are paying more. It adds to the inflation. Government is never going to spend its money better than you, especially when they're basically involved in picking winners and losers and giving kickbacks to special interests who have given them contributions or donations, or they have political influence.
And the farmers don't like this cap and trade scheme at all. They were promised an exemption from the taxes for their fuel, and then the bureaucrats of the Department of Ecology basically reneged on that promise and said, no, we don't have any plan for giving you that money back or exempting you from that money in the first place.
Okay.
And then once we shined a light on that, then ecology started backpedaling and said, okay, we'll come up with some kind of plan to credit farmers.
Okay.
But it was a messy business, and there's no doubt that farmers around the state don't like the cap and trade scheme at all. And this is not a Republican-Democrat issue. The people who supported 2117, the 400, almost 500,000 Washingtonians who signed the petitions, cross all political lines, they cross all demographic lines. They were Republicans and Democrats, they were independents, they were white, they were black, they were Asian, they were Hispanic. It is supported across the board by Washingtonians.
I want to make sure you jump in, please.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll find out this November. We have dairy farmers in Sunnyside who oppose the initiative because we're seeing investments from the CCA in sustainable dairy farming practices. We have firefighters in Morton and Lewis County opposing the initiative because of how the initiative would defund our forest health investments and our wildfire response. We have the Squamish tribe opposing the initiative because of how the initiative would defund our salmon recovery efforts. We have $25 million that we allocated for nuclear energy. We're not just talking about biofuels and wind and solar. We're also talking about nuclear energy, clean technologies that Washington has really led the world on and can lead the world on in the future, that we invested this year's budget to grow the technology related to small modular reactors. So, but what we know for sure is that if we pass the initiative, then we allow unlimited pollution in the state and we defund all of those programs.
Okay. We need to start wrapping up here, and this has been a great conversation. I thank you. Maybe I can ask you, Paula, just some final words for voters considering their choice over 2117.
Absolutely. I would say to voters that, we hear you. We hear your pain points, and what we've heard for too long is that your health can no longer wait. That people have to be placed over the interests of politics and special interests. So I think everybody at the table agrees. I hear what Glenn's saying. I hear what Chairman Walsh is saying. The people have spoken, and the people have said that we can't wait another day to solve the issue of climate injustice, that it was now or never, and the people chose now.
Got it.
And they're saying no. Vote no on 2117.
Got it. Glenn, some final thoughts, if you can keep it to less than a minute, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a hard thing to explain to people. If you vote yes, then you're going to pay less, and you're going to pay less on your power bill and your fuel. So that's not a difficult thing for average people to understand, which is why it was so easy collecting signatures on this initiative, just as a volunteer when I was doing it. And I only did it a few times in a number of places around the state. The average people don't like paying more, and they don't like paying more into opaque schemes, and especially when government tells them that things that they pretended they were funding before now is going to suddenly go away because you're taking this new windfall of another $1.5 billion into the kitty, and that you deserve to pay another $1,500 to them every year. That's just too much. I think average people, they want to keep their money.
Got it. Representative Walsh, we've got here in April already $11 million is poured into the No campaign. We talked about Bill Gates donating $1 million to this already. I know there's going to be a lot of talk about this, and how do you see this play out? Is it going to be more fundraising to counter? Some final thoughts here, please.
Well, the yes campaign for 2117 is easier than the no campaign. All we have to do is be straightforward and tell the truth about what the initiative will do, which is help working families and regular people all around the state with their cost of living. So we've got the straight arrow approach here. The ones who are arguing no, they've got to make a more convoluted, complex argument. And they're going to have to raise a lot more money than they've raised to convince people that, that this good reform is somehow not good.
We will see. Are you concerned about that group that's coming together here when we talk about BP and all these other groups coming together?
No. They're gonna defend the scheme that they like, that benefits them, and that's the system. They're welcome to do that.
Okay.
But in the end, I think truth will prevail.
All right. I'd like to give you the final word here, if I could, Representative Fitzgibbon, just to wrap this up.
Sure. I think that Washingtonians are proud of the fact that we've led the nation, that we've led the world in fighting climate change. Don't want to see us take a big step backwards by allowing more pollution that harms all of our health, but particularly the health of our seniors, of our kids, of people with respiratory ailments. That allowing more pollution into our lungs and into our homes and into our air is not the step that Washingtonians are going to want to take this fall. I think that's why you see so much support for the No campaign. So many people don't want to see us roll the dice on our health and on our climate for our kids and for generations to come.
All right. Thank you all for this input, and we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about I-2117?
That certainly covers the territory. Thank you for all being here, and I hope that gives you some food for thought. And obviously, no one will be here to answer your questions on that one, but we soldier on. Thanks a million. Take care. Bill has words.
The Election Forums Committee wants to offer its thanks to Mr. Prestridge for his presentation, to our moderator, Bobby Spaeth, for her presiding, and to you for your interest in attending. This ends our first fall forum. The next forum will be held here in Anderson Hall and simultaneously on HHTV on the 30th of September, a week from tonight. It will present candidates for 2 elective positions. We hope to see you here then. Good night.